With topic 13, unfortunately, they don't give us very much detail about the main fighting strategy used, which was trench warfare. So, in this presentation, you're going to learn more about that style of fighting and how it led to a stalemate, but some of the greatest advancements in technology when it comes to weapons during World War I. So, on this intro slide here, you can see some pictures. And the one on the right is actually an aerial shot of what trenches in a certain region look like today. So they were dug far enough into the grounds in some places where they didn't refill with earth even after this long a time. And that's where what it looks like in some places. So, what is trench warfare? Well, technically, it's defined as a style of fighting used during World War I in which opposing sides dug out and fought from trenches facing one another. So essentially, the soldiers are digging holes in the ground and fighting across a distance of land. You can see sort of in the center here, which would be known as no man's land.
Trench warfare. Trench cross-section. World War I. On the Western Front, trench systems were developed into a sophisticated network. In 1914, trenches were quickly dug out by both sides, parallel to each other, from the North Sea through Belgium and France. The trenches would offer some protection for the troops from overwhelming enemy artillery and infantry fire. Entrenching was the fast method of creating a trench system by having soldiers dig foxholes. This was dangerous, as it would be done in the line of sight of the enemy. A sapper could then transform this into a more sophisticated trench system that was deep enough for a man to safely stand up. As the war went on, the trench systems became more complex for permanent occupation. The wall facing the enemy was called a parapet, which was strengthened with sandbags to protect from enemy fire and wooden planks to strengthen the sides of the trench from collapsing in. Here, there was a fire step that formed a firing position and a way for the soldier to step out onto no man's land. An ammunition shelf was also dug into the side. The wall facing the back of the trench was called the parados. Here were dugouts where the soldier could eat and sleep and seek protection from artillery bombardments. More sophisticated protection came in the form of underground bunkers, which could also be used for storage of ammunition, food, and weapons, as well as command centers for officers to communicate orders with headquarters. On the floor were duck boards to provide secure ground and aid in drainage to keep the soldiers' feet away from the water, which caused diseases such as trench foot in the muddy, soggy terrain of the Western Front. Trenches were built in zigzags instead of straight lines, so that if the enemy managed to enter it, they would not be able to shoot down them. A typical trench system was 3 lines, approximately 800 yards or 730 meters apart. The first line, that was nearest to the enemy, was the fire trench. This was the most unpleasant and dangerous place to be. They were about 8 feet or 2.4 meters deep and 6 feet or 1.8 meters wide. The fire trench was the main line of resistance, with machine gun nests placed at strategic points and barbed wire placed in the front area known as no man's land. The sapper would also dig out a sap head, which went slightly ahead into no man's land to form a listening post. The second line was the support trench, forming the second line of defense if the first line was taken away by the enemy. A kitchen and a dressing station kept the men fed and treated for any wounds. Soldiers were rotated every week between front line and support trenches. The third line was the reserve trench. These were connected to each other through communication trenches, which were used to transport soldiers, ammunition, and food supplies, and orders from trench line to trench line. Latrines were also placed along these trenches. Behind these lines were artillery. German trench systems tended to be better overall in comparison to British trenches because of a number of reasons. One was that the British thought the trenches would only be temporary, whereas the Germans accepted that stalemate would set in and put the effort into developing better trenches, including more comfortable bunkers that were deeper into the ground, away from artillery fire. On the Western Front, the Germans were also on higher ground than the British, who were in the lowlands. This meant that the British Army would be in unpleasant terrain, with high water levels and mud. Watch our other videos to learn more.
All right, moving on to the next slide. There we go. Here's another view of what that cross section of a frontline trench would look like. And just a couple of things I wanted to note here was the fire step. In some cases, they would actually just have ladders here because it was too steep for a soldier just to climb out of the trench, even with a fire step. So, again, in some cases, they would have ladders here along this edge. The other thing that's really important that you'll hear noted a few times are the importance of these duck boards. And I'm not sure exactly why they're called duck boards, but basically they were wooden boards that laid across the bottom of the trenches in hopes of keeping the soldiers' feet out of the water that would collect on the bottom of the trenches. Later in the presentation, you'll see why that was so important, keeping their feet dry. But a few important things to point out here. Here's a real life photo of basically the same thing. You can see this is from the Battle of the Somme in a British trench. So there are a few soldiers who are just kind of hanging out along the sides here, sleeping, resting. It must be a downtime. And you can see this soldier on what would be the fire step of this trench. All right, this picture is a great aerial shot of an example of what one side of the trenches might look like. So down here, starting in the left-hand corner, you can see these soldiers coming across what is known as no man's land. And this was a stretch of land between the two opposing sides. So this land existed between the two front opposing trenches, and it was full of artillery shell holes. Most of the trees and vegetation often was dead. It was really muddy. There were dead bodies and horses, and it was very dangerous because there wasn't a lot of cover for soldiers coming across trying to get to the other side's front line. So they were easy targets coming across no man's land. The other important thing that I wanted to point out about this picture is that aircraft at the time during World War I at first were used more so to scout from up in the sky so they could report, as you can see, of the enemies grouping together, getting ready for an assault, gathering supplies, things like that. Airplanes with weapons weren't as advanced or developed at the beginning of World War I, but towards the end of World War I, they had guns on the airplanes. We can see here too machine gun houses. These were cement, like little sheds, if you will, that had very small openings at the top, just wide enough of a slot for somebody to be able to look through so that it was still protecting a soldier in there as well. But these did a lot of damage to these soldiers coming across no man's land. And then all the way in the back here, you can see this is where the long range artillery would be. So these are the big guns like the howitzers, some different types of cannons. These shells would basically be sent out at the beginning of battle ahead of soldiers in an attempt to kill and take out any of the opposing enemies, also crossing out into no man's land. But it sometimes backfired and the artillery would hit their own soldiers. These often were kept far behind the front line, Up to 6 miles is what I researched, which is incredible, an incredible distance. All right, again, here is a real aerial shot of two different sides of trenches, two opposing sides, I should say. So it's no man's land, exists in the middle right here, sort of this bend. It almost looks like a river. And then this over on the left side, you can see are the British trenches. And then these taking up most of the space in the picture are the German trenches. All right, and then here another important map showing us a section of Belgium and Germany and also France where a lot of the trenches were dug out over the course of World War I. And you can see here that this region is known as the Western Front. And it was over 400 miles of trenches that existed. There were actually two different fronts in World War I. However, most of the major fighting occurred on the Western Front. Timeout. Sorry, I know you don't see what I want you to see. Give me a second here.
Are you still wearing enough layers to insulate Alaska? That's why you need the new and improved bearskin hoodie, the 6-pocket pull.
Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific. It's mud, it's death, it's rats, it's stench, and soldiers develop an attitude in a trench that everybody is going to die.
Life in the trench was abysmal. There were several lines of trenches, and the front line trenches, of course, were the most dangerous because they were constantly under fire. Incoming!
The Germans dug assiduously, building dry, safe, and comfortable trenches for themselves with bunkers that actually had electricity and sometimes running water. The British and French, who were convinced that they were never going to be there for that long, didn't spend nearly the same effort. And so their trenches tended to be muddy and wet and not that safe.
Disease ran rampant. It was very difficult to get any sort of sleep, a decent hot meal, keep your clothes dry, and more importantly, to keep your sanity.
There were so many health problems of just simple disease that took much more men out of combat than direct fire.
I think one word that would surprise people about life in a trench: boredom. A lot of time is spent just sitting, cleaning tools, and being scared to death the battle's going to start any minute.
Was just the day-to-day monotony of being trapped in this very small space and fighting for a war that's really fought in inches.
The idea of open warfare, of fighting out into what they called no man's land, wasn't working. The technology of the war had advanced so much with machine guns, artillery that could lob shells a mile. It became mostly a defensive war early on, and as a defensive war, you wanted to protect your troops, so the miles and miles of trenches were built.
There were often bodies buried in the sides of trenches, bodies lying out in the open in front of the trenches. The soldiers were experiencing not only the war that they were fighting at the moment, but the war that had been going on throughout those trenches for all of the years of the war.
A young lieutenant writes his mother and says, "I haven't been killed yet, but it's only a matter of time." That's typical of the way soldiers felt about life in the trench. You just did it. You existed day to day, tried to go on, keep your chin up, but one day, the bullet was going to have your name on it, and you were going to perish. You weren't going home. Life in a trench, I'd like to explain in one word: horrific.
All right, let's see if I can't get back to our presentation here. Give me just 1 second. All right, so one of the next horrifying aspects of trench warfare was the attraction of rats in the trenches due to the dead. So many men killed in the trenches were buried almost where they fell. Their corpses, as well as the food scraps that littered the trenches, attracted rats. Here are some quotes from some soldiers. Listen to these. The rats were huge. They were so big they would eat a wounded man if he couldn't defend himself. I saw some rats running from under the dead man's greatcoats. Enormous rats, fat with human flesh. My heart pounded as we edged toward one of the bodies. His helmet had rolled off. The man displayed a grimacing face, stripped of flesh, the skull bare, the eyes devoured, and from the yawning mouth leapt a rat. All right, another danger or hazard of life in the trenches was the water that often flooded these trenches. So, because of the area, and especially when it came to the British, who were given an area lower than what the Germans had, as soon as they dug, they would hit water under the surface. Trenches often became waterlogged, and heavy storms could lead to flooding. It was not uncommon for soldiers to drown in their own trenches. Duck boards were laid at the bottom of the trenches to try and keep soldiers' feet as dry as possible to prevent trench foot, a common problem. So here we see the health concern with having our feet wet. Here we see some pretty graphic pictures. So the one on top is what trench foot would look like earlier in the process before it got really bad. And then you see some extreme cases in the pictures at the bottom. So trench foot began with a gradual numbness in the feet, followed by them turning red or blue and becoming swollen and blistered. Sometimes they became gangrenous and might need to be amputated. So some of these toes in the pictures down here you can see are black, like that skin, that flesh is dead, so they're not going to have use of those extremities any longer. And this was all due just to their feet being wet all the time. All right, the last slide in the presentation here, as you can see, breaks down the military casualties in World War I, so the deaths. Highlighted in sort of a dark red color, you can see the countries that experienced the highest number of casualties. So Germany, Russia, France, and then Austria-Hungary. So we're definitely talking numbers in the millions, and I don't believe, no, this does not include civilian casualties. So these are just military casualties. So the number actually was a lot higher than what we see here on this chart. Trench warfare had been used before World War I. However, it was the sole strategy used in fighting during World War I, which led to both sides coming to a stalemate. And that vocab term means basically neither side was making any progress. So although they had all these advances in weapons, they were basically just killing great numbers of their opponents without really making any territorial progress or meeting success gaining territory.